Okay, so here we are at a historical place where an event took place in 1942 with respect to the Sleepy Lagoon murders of a one Hector Diaz. One of the 17 members who was accused at that time is no longer with us. However, he was the great uncle of a person I'm about to introduce you to, and that person's name is Steve DeRoos. And Steve is going to give us his tale and his perspective from a historical as well as from a family and personal journey with respect to his uncle at that time.
Thank you, Raymond. You know, this is all kind of very interesting because growing up, I didn't know about this. It's something that happened in our family, and actually it was my mother's uncle, who was only a couple years different age from her. They're almost like brother and sister. But I had some pictures that I used to look at when I was a kid. And these pictures are of a bunch of guys here, you know, and then here's some other pictures of, you know, look like they're in an exercise yard or a gym or something like that. And I have a lot of other pictures, and I used to look at them as a kid, and I used to think, oh, well, these must be work photos or the YMCA or something. And then later on, and I think it was in the 70s when the play Zoot Suit came out, when Zoot Suit play came out, all of a sudden I found out that my uncle Smiles, his name is Ysmael, they called him Smiles Parra, that he was one of the defendants in this case, and he actually spent almost 2 years in San Quentin because of this. And so all of a sudden these pictures that I had now all of a sudden took on a different meaning. And it was just kind of interesting because he was part of that generation known as a silent generation. I mean, my aunts and uncles, they never talked about this. We didn't know anything about any of this until the play came out. And then all of a sudden we started asking questions and putting things together. And all of a sudden it became this thing that, you know, affected my family greatly, and obviously affected my uncle, and it affected my mom because she was very close to him. And I never knew anything of it. And so once I found out about it, it was like, well, gosh, you know, this story has to be repeated. Other people need to know this. It needs to be passed on to my children, you know, and my children's children. We can't forget this because it's about a time in our city where there was a lot of prejudice towards Mexican Americans, and a lot of things happened in this. And so during the course of explaining all of this stuff to my daughter, who eventually became a history teacher, and so she took it from there, and she's the one who actually has done a lot of research on this and has a historical background on all of this.
Steve, from your uncle's perspective, when you would talk to him about this, what would he recollect and share with you?
He was very quiet about it, and sometimes you would ask him some questions and he would just kind of almost shut down. He would just kind of internally, you know. It's a time when he was picked up for this murder. You know, they were just rounding up people, and he was already married. He had a daughter. You know, he was moving on with his life. He wasn't part of a youth scene or gang scene or any of that, but he was picked up with a lot of these other individuals, and so his life was shattered, and it was something that he never talked about. And so when you would ask him questions about it, it was almost like you were going into that secret hiding place where he had spent a lot of his life not really talking about it, because again, we're talking about a silent generation who doesn't, you know, want to share their feelings so much. They internalize everything. And so, but he would, you know, he would talk about it, and it was, he never expressed bitterness and anger. It was more like, this is kind of what happened to us, and you know, very unfortunate that it happened, and we've moved on with it. And so I think the fact that it was so many years removed, it was probably easier for him to handle it, rather than if those questions would have been asked of him back in the 50s or 40s, you know, when all this stuff was still fresh in his mind. Because when I was talking to him, he was already up in his 60s, early 70s and stuff like that.
Thank you. And one more question that I have is, from where you're at in your life right now and the perspective of what you saw back then in the 40s to what you see in today's society, do you see history to some degree repeating itself, or would you say that we've come a long way? And you personally, what impact did it have on you in terms of how you saw things at that age when you first found out?
Well, what was interesting is that our family unit, you know, we were we're Mexicans, Americans. And there was never any talk of, well, we hate the police, we hate this group, we hate that group. None of that was there. It was, we are Americans, we're part of this country, where this is our country. Sometimes unfortunate things happen, and you resolve them, you do the best you can to resolve the injustices, and you move on. So there was never any bitterness inside the family, even though my uncle, spent 2 years of his life in San Quentin, and ultimately lost his relationship with his wife and daughter, and over all of this, through separation. But again, there was no lingering hatred there. What I see today is sometimes just hatred just kind of keeps going on, and people don't know how to resolve issues, I think, and move forward for the benefit of everyone. And so that was one of the things I was very grateful for my family, is that, it wasn't even though it was prejudice towards us, that prejudice didn't extend outward to other people.
Your family, in terms of future generations of your family, your children, your children's children, children's children's children, will one day see this. Is there anything, before we close and move on to Adrian, your daughter, that you would like to share with respect to this, other than what we've talked about already?
Just know the story. You have to be in touch with who you are, where you came from, the things that caused you to be who you are and shaped you. We can be shaped good or we can be shaped wrong. And so we always want to learn from those things that shape us in a positive manner. And so even though there was things that happened out of this that were absolutely horrible, there's still some takeaway out of this that we can use to strengthen the family and as individuals and move forward.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. And what I'd like to do now is just show you kind of some of the area with respect to, in today's times, this is more of a industrial complex facility within the general neighborhood. However, we tried to pinpoint exactly as close as possible of where the location may have taken place where this crime was committed, but not by the 17 that were indicted. And what I did was, we found this stretch of field that just doesn't belong anywhere here in this part of town. And when you take it all the way over there and cross through that yard, it continues on under the train tracks. So I do believe that at this time in 1942, this was considered Williams Ranch. So now we're going to introduce to you Adrienne DeLama. She is a U.S. history teacher at John Glenn High School, and she is Steve DeRoos's daughter. So Adrienne, please give us your perspective and how it applies to you at this time in your life and in your teachings.
The way I normally tackle the subjects within my U.S. history class is, it is the prelude to the Zoot Suit Riots. And so we come out of our unit of study with the Great Depression. They learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we start talking about the Mexican repatriation, where they were actually, during the Great Depression, they were taking Mexican Americans, even naturally born citizens, and sending them back to Mexico. And it wasn't just in Southern California, it was throughout other states as well, but it was kind of like, there's no jobs for us, so they're getting paid less, let's send them back to wherever they came from. And so another hook that I use is, a lot of my kids know about Zoot Suits, they've seen the movie or they've heard about the play or something, and so I'll say, okay, who's seen it, and there's always a kid in class who's like, oh yeah, the pachucos and this and that, and I'll say, well, it's based off of my family's history, and my uncle Smiles. And they're like, wait, your uncle was Smiley? I go, no, my uncle Smiles, and let me tell you who Ysmael Parra is. And so then I'll go into the whole backstory of how there was the death, how this kid was found dying, and they started basically rounding up these kids. My uncle at the time was in his early 20s, married, had a little girl, beautiful wife, beautiful family, and was just part of this, we need to blame somebody, so let's blame these people. And so a few days after that, then you have where they actually go in, and the police are rounding up other Mexican American youth, and 600 kids, misdemeanor crimes or alleged assaults.
A Pele?
Yeah, it's assaults, alleged assaults.
Okay.
And 600, just a week
600?
later, 600. So by August 10th,
right.
600 youth had been, taken in. And you can really look at history, it's easier to kind of digest it and look at it from a perspective years removed. And when, you see that there was always this animosity against Mexican Americans and such, and then this happened, and then a year after the actual court proceeding, then you get the Zoot Suit Riots and the things that came after that. So we look at the bigger picture, but then I come in and I also share my family's story in the midst of that, and I bring in pictures of him and his family and his daughter and what happened to him.
Did you ever have a chance to talk to your uncle?
I did. And every time I hear, and we get choked up thinking about this, the Dodgers and Vin Scully, that was my uncle. I would go over on Saturdays to go visit my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and he was either in front of the TV watching the Dodgers, Vin Scully's voice I would always hear, and I knew where Uncle Smiles was, or he was in the back in the yard listening to him on the radio, old school style.
Nice.
And I was about 10, 12 years old when I started to learn about the trial, the Sleepy Lagoon trial and stuff. And my mom asked me, she goes, you should talk to Uncle Smiles about it. So I did. I started asking him questions, and he was open. Uncle Smiles was always very reserved, very quiet, very good looking man all the way to the very end, very slender, always kept in shape. And he started talking to me about it, and I asked him questions about the play and the movie because I had just seen the movie. And then I asked about his daughter, and that's when, as a young girl, hearing it was a loud silence because he got quiet, he got reserved, and a little choked up. And it was having to understand at the age of 10, everything that was taken from him. And his wife ended up leaving him, his daughter. They moved to Arizona eventually. And so it was more than just 2 years of his life that was gone, and he was, wrongfully accused of this horrendous crime, but there was more that was taken from him. And the silent generation, they didn't talk about things, they just kind of endured. And it was a testament to, what I kind of experienced in that moment with that silent loudness.
Silent loudness, that's interesting and very dramatic. How do your students today take history from that perspective of what you shared? Just what does it mean to them?
Well, we relate it to now. I use a slinky in my classroom, and I see if you have the beginning timeline of from the beginning of time all the way to the end, and you zoom in on that line, that timeline, it's more of a slinky. You see these repetition that kind of transpires over time, and they're able to now internalize it. And what have they gone into? What has their family endured? Being Mexican American, growing up in California, and I'm always big about making sure that they understand their own root system and where they tie into it. My daughter, she's on my side of the family, she's 5th and 6th generation born American. On my husband's side, she's 1st generation. So it's very important that as Americans, there's no race, color, one language. It's you're American, and you're tied into that American dream, and where you come into that line, you make it happen. And I'm big about teaching competitive drive within my classroom. It's one thing to have drive where you're competing, with trying to get to an end goal, and there's another thing where you're competing in competition, but when you put it together, you're competing with yourself. And another big thing I know we talked about before was, what is my daughter? Where is she in the grand schemes of this? I really believe we all have destinies, and there's reason why God put us through what we did or what we go through. And even with my Uncle Smiles, as to what happened with him, there's a reason why he was set there, why this took place to him, and what is the sense that we make out of it.
I'm sorry, why was he referred to as Uncle Smiles?
Ismael is his real name.
I see. In closing, is there anything from a different perspective that you'd like to share with your students and or your family, future generations to come, that you haven't already mentioned?
Yeah, and it's that no matter what you go through in life, no matter what's thrown at you, whatever people say about you, that doesn't define who you are. What defines who you are is how you are going to take what is said, what happens at that particular moment. and how you react to it. And nothing can change that. You can only control yourself in the situation. And I think that's the big thing that happened with my family in this situation is it didn't define who he was. It didn't define who our family was. But we kept moving on and we kept pressing on with that. And that's the big takeaway I always tell my kids and also my students in my classroom as well.
Well, Adrian, thank you for that historical perspective and adventure and journey. And with that, today we're going to close on the story of Hector Diaz, the poor gentleman that was murdered. And to this day, they never found out who murdered him in this area of Los Angeles back in 1942. So with that being said, I'm glad that your uncle was found innocent along with everyone else. And I would like to thank you and for being a part of These Curious Times network production. Stay curious. Thank you.
I want a zoot suit with the replete with the draper shape and stuff. Come to look sharp enough to see my sunny gal. I want a reeve sleeve with the right stripe and a dress vest with the glad plaid in the latest fad. See my sunny gal. I want to look keen so my dream will say you don't.